Welcome and thanks for making the time to join us to our webinar, Boosting Livestock Performance with Elise Bowen. As we wait for people to join us, I'll start by introducing myself. My name's Bronwyn Bant and I'm the Sustainable Ag Facilitator with the Women's CMA. We're also joined by Tani Burgess from Vic Landcare, who's helping us out. Before we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm on today in Horsham. That's the Watchabolik, Jadwa, Jalbajali, Wagai and the Yapagok, and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that welcome to traditional owners joining us on the webinar today. And it would be also remiss if I didn't acknowledge our funding. So the webinar today is funded with support from the Victorian Carbon Farming Outreach Program, which is delivered with the funding support from the Department of Ag, Fisheries and Forestries, and it's a partnership today between Glenelg Hopkins CMA, Women's CMA and Landcare Victoria. Today's webinar format is fairly straightforward. I'll go through some general housekeeping before Elise's presentation, and we'll finish with plenty of time for questions, a quick evaluation, and some information about upcoming events and resources. And in terms of housekeeping, please keep your microphone muted to limit disruptions. Tani has kindly offered to provide some tech support today if needed. So you've got her contact number there, and it's also in the email we sent earlier today. And the webinar is being recorded, so you're welcome to leave your camera off if you prefer. We're delighted to have Elise join us for today's webinar. Elise grew up on a family sheep farm in York, WA, and graduated from Murdoch Uni with a Bachelor of Animal Science in 2012. Following graduation, Elise worked with the Murdoch and WA Department of Ag sheep team on national research projects before establishing her own business, Sheep Data Management, in 2014. Elise is now based in Griffith in the Riverina region of New South Wales. Welcome, Elise. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. And yeah, look, thanks for pulling this event together and for the invitation to present today. It's always nice to be asked to share what I do for a living, and I'm pretty passionate, as Bronwyn is too, about all things sheep data. So I've got a presentation that I'm going to share, and we have talked about putting a few slides in along the way just to pause for some questions. So you can put questions in the chat, which will be monitored by Tani and Bronwyn, or wait until those opportunities arise, and please do ask questions, because I do really want everyone to get out of this session, to get something out of this session. There's going to be quite a variety of people experience and knowledge in the group, so hopefully there'll be something in there for everyone. Let me share my screen. Hopefully I've nailed that. It looks like I have. Alrighty. So I suppose overall, when we're thinking about collecting data in a sheep flock, we're thinking about increasing our productivity, so producing more from less, and lowering our emissions. Things like having higher growth rates in our young stock, but also I suppose in our core breeding flock, which can result in a faster turn-off time. So that's going to lower our emissions, because we're not keeping those animals on the property for as long as we might need to if they have slower growth rates. Higher reproduction rates, obviously producing more from less. So we can use data to track and monitor our reproduction rates and get them as high as possible, obviously within an optimum range. That's very desirable. And also one of the key outcomes is to identify individuals in our flock that perform and identify the passengers. So those individuals that just coast along and are often having the same costs in terms of inputs for feed and other inputs, but not producing as much. So they're the passengers. If we can identify them and get rid of them, we're going to be really increasing our productivity and lowering our emissions. So we have the tag. This has, largely been imposed on us now. There have been quite a few early adopters of eID technology in the sheep space, but the long and short of it is we all have the tags now. So we really need to think about what can we do with them to improve our efficiencies and our productivity. So I'm going to go through what types of tech are out there in terms of there's tags, there's different data capture devices. I call them readers or indicators. They're basically the computers that you're using to capture and record information and recall information in yards. And then there are software programs, which are really handy for the data collation and analysis side of things. Every time you go to a field day, there'll be different reps there from a heap of different companies, and the products can largely be grouped into these three categories, and they all have slightly different features and functions, but they have a lot of commonalities between them. So it's often pretty hard to make a choice, but there are a few common ones that I'll describe today. What kinds of data can we collect? A couple of key points I would make from the outset are to always keep in mind that you want to focus on your profit drivers and your breeding objective. So make sure that you're collecting, if you're going to put time and effort and cost into collecting data, make sure it's relevant to your enterprise and it's relevant to your profit drivers. Otherwise, there's not much merit to spending that time and money. Also, a note that it's important to refine, or I believe it's important to refine your genetics and your animal management first before you go out and spend a heap of time collecting individual animal data, because I believe you can make a lot more gains in the first instance if you've got some severe limitations to your genetics or your animal management. So collecting individual animal data is really the icing on the cake once you've got those fundamentals right. So in terms of the eID tags, you get this radio frequency ID number, which if you look in this little snippet from the spreadsheet is in column B, the eID number, and they are all unique. So when you scan that RFID chip and that number comes up on your stick reader or on your indicator, they're all a unique number. And the first three numbers there, so in this example, the 982, denotes the company that the tag of manufacturer of the tag. So 982 is an All Flex tag, 940 is a Shearwell, and there are a few more examples. So when I open a file that someone's emailed me, I automatically know which company they're purchasing their tags from based on that 3-letter prefix. There's a file called a bucket file, which hopefully most of the people in this session are familiar with, but essentially a bucket file comes from your manufacturer and it contains a heap of columns, and this is a snapshot up there of a bucket file, and you'll get more columns as well. So you get the NLIS ID, you get the chip or the RFID number, the visual ID if you've asked to have your tags printed with a visual ID, and that should be a 6-digit number starting with the year of birth of the animals. The bucket file will also contain things like the tag color, your pick number, and the date that you've ordered the tags. But the two main ones we're interested in are the eID and the VID number. And I always suggest to get a VID number printed on your tags, even if all your lambs, you don't need to know which individual is which. Obviously, they are an individual with an eID number, but that visual tag number is so handy because there are instances where you won't have a scanner with you and you might be out in the paddock treating a fly-struck lamb or pulling a lamb out of a ewe, and you want to note that that animal has had some intervention for some reason, but you don't want to carry a stick reader around with you. If you've printed a visual number on those tags, you can just take a photo with your phone or jot down their visual tag number in a notebook, and then you can go back to the office and very quickly look that animal up in your Excel file and make that note against that tag for later purposes. So I think it's a great idea to always get the visual number printed on the tags. In terms of readers and indicators, up on the screen here, I've got a couple of photos of some of the TrueTest equipment. So the top one is a panel reader that mounts onto a weigh crate, so you can scan tags. Scan tags as you're weighing. The bottom one is the main weigh scale indicator, XR5000, and most of the producers I work with use TrueTest equipment. I use TrueTest equipment and I'm most comfortable with it. They have really great level of customer service, really great products. The other, I suppose, main competitor is Gallagher. They have orange coloured equipment. And there are a couple of others popping up now that are offering different types of readers and indicators. But in my experience, TrueTest is by far and wide the most commonly used. So all of the examples I'm going to go through today are going to be using the TrueTest equipment. So hopefully that will be helpful for those who have that gear. The readers can be a mobile stick reader, which looks like a sword basically, or the fixed panel reader, which is the black one in the image on the screen. And the indicators can double as a weigh scale. So a lot of people would already have one of these pre-eID, and they're just using them to weigh sheep and not recording it against an eID tag. But essentially, once you have it set up with eID tags in your sheep and you're telling it to record eIDs, bam, you can start recording information against those individuals. There's lots of commercial software programs out there and probably will become more and more in the future. Sapien, the top one, they have products called Cool Collect and Cool Perform. There's Practical Systems or Stockbook. They have been rebranded, so I'm not 100% sure. I think they're called Outcross Systems now, maybe. And there's a product called Breed Elite. These are probably the main three that I hear of in my client network. They do have, so software programs do have value in terms of collating data and maintaining data integrity. So one of the risks of using Excel, if you're not au fait with Excel and using it all the time, is it's very easy to accidentally scramble your data without realizing it, and mix match the animal ID from the data. And it's really hard to sometimes realize that you've done it. And when you do realize you've corrupted the data set, it's really hard to undo the mistakes and know when the mistakes were made. And then often you'll have to start all over again. So whilst I'm very comfortable and my preference is working in Excel, for people who aren't as comfortable with Excel, there's definitely a role for these commercial programs. A lot of the time, stud producers use these commercial programs because they have really great screens for classing stock in the yards, as well as interfacing with submissions to sheep genetics and things like that, and building catalogs and pen cards. So they're very well used, I suppose, in the stud game. For commercial producers and also a lot of stud producers, my preference, I suppose, is working in Excel, and doing you can do a lot of basic stuff in Excel that a lot of producers spend quite a bit of money on these commercial programs and don't really get the value out of them. So I would always say start off with what's freely available and maybe get a little bit of help and some pointing in the right direction. And once you become comfortable with what you're doing and you really want to take it to the next level, maybe then it's time to look into a commercial software program. So I suppose, yeah, just don't get sucked into spending a lot of money up front if you're just getting started. Here's one of my tips. So on that vein, I would say, work out what you want to collect, I suppose, what you want your output to look like, and that will help you define what you need to collect. And consider outsourcing your data management or getting a bit of help, or using a suitable software program to generate usable feedback. Because if you're just continuing to collect a lot of data and you end up with a whole heap of weight files in Excel, but you never actually do anything with them, collating them together or putting them into some sort of data warehouse to do some sort of analysis, obviously, nothing's going to happen. And the longer you put it off, the more of a headache it is, because when you do finally get some help, whether that's getting access to a program or someone to help you, it takes a lot of work to put a heap of retrospective stuff in. And also sometimes by that point, you've forgotten what it is that you went out to collect in those files and what your plans were for collating and analysing that data. So a lot of it will get wasted. I like to break down the value of individual animal data into two main streams. The one that I spend a lot of time in with the stud breeders is in the breeding and selection decisions arm. So things like evaluating your ram team, which can obviously be done in a commercial situation as well. So assessing bought-in genetics, if you're obviously buying rams from different studs, you've got the opportunity with individual animal data to track the progeny of those different ram teams. Obviously, if you lamb in your sire groups, put a tag in the ear, and then those lambs can be run together for the rest of their life. And you can analyze the production of your breeding flock, the fleece production of the ewes, the lamb production of the ewes, reproduction rates, and those sort of things. You can analyze the growth rates in your lambs when you're finishing lambs for market. So I think helping you to understand how your genetics are performing and making some decisions about, am I happy with where I'm sourcing my genetics from, or should I trial something else and see how they stack up? I think that's a really valuable tool that you can do. The other one is in ewe selection, and that's about identifying the performers and the passengers. So who do we want to keep and who do we want to cull? We can also make some decisions about joining allocations. So things like which ewes are going to go into my breeding flock to breed my replacement maternal merino sheep, or who are going to breed, just go into the cull flock. And I'm not going to keep the progeny of those ewes. So, ram team evaluation and ewe selection, some of the key applications from a breeding selection decisions perspective. The other really great value of individual animal data, which is often overlooked, and it does have greater application in commercial flocks, is improving your management decisions. So making accurate and timely management decisions on farm about things like reproduction management. So understanding how your breeding flock respond in terms of their joining weight and condition score targets, and the implications on their reproduction rates. So we can really drive our decisions based on how they perform and based on real data in your flock. Also, with growth rates in your lambs, you can monitor those growth rates and help you make some more accurate decisions when you're forecasting your turn-off dates and wanting to get lambs booked in with processors and things like this. So there's some really good applications of individual animal data that mob-based stuff can give you an idea of, on average, how you're performing, but you don't have that. I suppose you don't really have a clear picture of the distribution of all those individuals in the flock and how those individuals are responding to different situations. So one of the key things I think everyone should start off with, if you haven't done this already, is defining your breeding objective. So there are a few elements to this. One is, what are your key profit drivers? So what are the things, obviously, that are making you money? And they're usually pretty easy to identify. They're, things that you can sell, so things that you're producing, but they're also things like welfare traits, things that are costing you money. So if you're in an area that's really affected by worms, a profit driver for you might be having sheep that require less drenching. It might be easy care sheep that don't get fly struck as much. So, some of your profit drivers might be things like having bearer breaches, for example. So, growth rate, reproduction, carcass, but also, they're producing more, but also think about the things that reduce your costs and reduce your labor, because they're really important. How to think about genetics and ram selection. So using breeding values is a really great tool when you're buying rams to make sure you're bringing in genetics that are performing for the traits that are aligning with your profit drivers. So if you're not buying rams with breeding values, you're really flying a bit blind. So try and source, genetics from studs that can benchmark their animals on a national scale, so you know what traits they are really strong in, and find out what traits they're measuring in their flock as well, so you've got accuracy behind those breeding values. And then have a think about, okay, we've refined the genetics that we're bringing into our flock. We know what our profit drivers are. So which traits are important to us and which traits could we measure in our flock? Because obviously there's going to be a lot of variation in our ewes. Can we identify those formers as well as the passengers for the key traits in our flock? So start off with a few basic ones. Reproduction's a really easy one to measure, because often your pregnancy scanner will be recording that for you on the day that he's there. So, that's often a bit of free information. You might want to measure a few fleece traits, weight, and, particularly around joining time, weight and condition score are really handy ones. And then monitoring growth in your lambs is another key one. So here's an example a breeding objective. And there's probably people on the call that have gone through a course such as lifetime ewe management or bred well, fed well, some really great industry courses, and they really get you to nail your breeding objective. So have something written down. This is just a pretty generic example of a wool production flock with surplus sheep sales. So identify your key profit drivers. So we've got some fleece traits, growth traits, and reproduction are important to us. We've now narrowed it down to a few key breeding values that are directly linked to those profit drivers. So we've got yearling clean fleece weight, yearling fibre diameter, yearling weight, number of lambs weaned, and yearling fat. So number of lambs weaned, I should have updated this, Bronwyn. Number of lambs weaned is now gone. There's another reproduction trait called weaning rate. But essentially, you want those breeding values that you're selecting your rams with to match up to those profit drivers. And then in terms of what traits we could measure in our commercial flock, they're very similar, I suppose, to your profit drivers and aligned with those breeding values. But then you want to put some targets and timeframes around those key traits. So you want to have an understanding of what your current position is now and what your target is. So obviously some traits you want to increase and some you want to decrease. So fleece weight's a trait you want to improve, and improving means the numbers getting higher, whereas micron, if you want to go finer, obviously the numbers to decrease. So which direction do you want that trait to go? And then set a bit of a time frame around it, so that in 5 years' time you can review, I suppose, your progress over that time frame and see were we aggressive enough with our ram selection? Were we aggressive enough with our ewe classing? Was our management enabling us to, I suppose, capitalise on the genetic improvement that we had, or was I held back by my management? So it's really important to set yourself some realistic targets and timeframes and then review them after that timeframe has passed, so you can pivot and you can go more aggressively if you need to, or reflect on why you haven't achieved what you set out to achieve. And leading on from your breeding objective, I like to start to make a data collection calendar. And the producers that I work with, nearly all of them, this is one of the earliest things I'll do with a producer that I'm helping, just so we're both on the same page, I suppose, about what those events and critical times are throughout the year when they're often already handling the sheep. So it's not an extra workload to collect data. It's often data that they're already, it's already sort of being collected, but it just needs to be recorded properly and accurately. And making sure that we're not missing opportunities throughout the year to collect something that is going to be meaningful from an analysis perspective. So I think this is a really good exercise to go through. Make up a little calendar for the key time points throughout the year, approximately when they are, and I've got in brackets the age of either the gestation of the pregnancy or the age of the lamb. So there's quite a range in when you can be collecting these things. And then what you're going to measure or record. So these are really some of the key things throughout the year that the basics of recording reproduction, collecting some information about the lamb's genetic background, and also some fleece and growth traits. So you can add to this, you can cross things off this list, you can highlight the ones that are important to you, but it's probably a very good starting point. So this data, this is really defining ahead of time what I'm going to be collecting and when, so that we don't miss anything. I'm going to pause now for questions, Bronwyn, and just let anyone who had, or if there's some in the chat relating to what I've gone through so far, I think it's worth having a pause.
There's nothing in the chat yet, but I'm happy if people want to raise their hands, I can take you off mute and you can ask a question.
Okay, just give everyone a few seconds, and please do jump in if there's something that you want me to clarify or share any experiences of your own.
Looks like you're right to go ahead.
Okay, and just there you are. Your little face disappeared. You're back again. Okay. Okay, so now the rest of my presentation is structured in 4 key sections, and I'm going to step through them one at a time. And this, in my mind, is the way I set out set out to, I suppose, strategically collect information and do something with it. So I'm going to focus firstly on collecting the data and some of the tips and tricks for how to do that effectively from my perspective, and some of the examples of setting up for different data collection. I'll then go to data collation. So that's how, when we've got a heap of sessions of weights or a few different files of pregnancy scanning results, how we go about pulling that data together. So we try and get everything into one data warehouse, whether that's an Excel file or a software program, because then we can do something with it. And that leads on to data analysis. This is the, crunching that data, a couple of the, I suppose, ways that you crunch the data and present, how I present the data back to clients in a meaningful way. And the most important one, though, is number 4, which is the implementation and decision making. Because if we don't have a plan for how we're going to implement the data or use the data, we won't be using it to make any decisions, and it's all going to be a waste of time and money. So we have to keep that implementation and decision making in our mind throughout this whole process. So we only want to be collecting data that has a clear plan for it at the end. And that's really reflected in your data collection calendar. Don't put stuff on there that you think, oh, that'll be interesting to collect, or I can collect that, but what are you going to do with it? It's really important to keep that in mind. So when we start off with collecting data, the first and foremost thing I would suggest is to, if you haven't already got your bucket file from your tag manufacturer, chase it down. So once your tags arrive, if they haven't emailed you through a bucket file, please chase it down from your tag supplier. So you've got it sitting there in your email inbox or somewhere on your computer, because the bucket file is going to match up your eID numbers with the visual tag numbers printed on the tags, which means something. So the next step is you want to set up new traits in your XR5000 or your data computer to record session and life data information. And I'm going to go through this. This is just a little bit of an overview. So you want to make sure that when you're recording information, those traits are existing and they're set up correctly to collect meaningful data. I'm going to go through downloading session files from the indicator, and there are a few different options with the XR5000. So once you've weighed animals or collected some information, how to get it off. And then I'll go through a couple of examples for collecting life data at pregnancy scanning and landmarking. So let's go back to eID bucket lists. I had this image up before. Source your bucket file from your tag supplier. The visual ID column needs to be unique, and that's why I always recommend, even though, every year, if you have 1,000 lambs and you order 1,000 tags each year, you'll have multiple sheep on your property with tag number 1 and tag number 2, etc. But they need to be unique to use that visual tag in your indicator. So if you turn it into a 6-digit ID, starting with the year of birth, so the first lamb born this year will be tagged with 250001, 25002, etc. And the first tag born next year will be 26001, 26002, etc. So those tags then become unique. That's a really important concept in your XR5000. You can't just type in visual ID 1, visual ID 2, because next year it won't allow you to type in visual ID 1. It'll say that one already exists. So very important to set this up correctly from the beginning. The bucket file also forms the basis of what I call your Excel master file, and I'll get into that a little bit later on. But those eID and VID columns are essentially the beginnings of your own little master file where you can store a heap of information about these animals. And there's a program which I'm going to show you a few screenshots of how that works. But there's a program called TrueTest Data Link, which helps you to transfer your eID and VID onto your XR5000. So you can do this as soon as your tags arrive, before your lambs are even born, so that the first time your tags are scanned, whether it's at landmarking or at weaning, you can scan that animal's tag and the visual number is already going to pop up on the screen. You don't have to type anything in. You don't have to risk making any mistakes with typing anything in. So I always recommend get this early, get it onto your data collection equipment early, so you're not having to type anything. It's a more comprehensive view of what a bucket list looks like. So we really only need to pay attention to 2 columns, the eID column, and this one's got a prefix 951 on it. I can't remember which company that is, but they're few different companies, and the visual ID is the other key column that we want there. So then what we want to do, and this is how to load it onto XR5000, we want to convert the bucket file in Excel to a format that will be recognized by the XR5000. And the XR5000 wants the exact column headings, VID and eID, as you can see in the second screen there. So you need those exact headings for the XR5000 to recognize what you're trying to put onto it. And then you obviously need the right formats to those IDs in the columns underneath. So the eID, you can see it's just copied across from the left to the right. And the visual ID, in my bucket file, I didn't actually have a column with a visual ID that looked like a visual ID. So you can see that column, I've got tag numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. in there, but I've had to convert them into an appropriate format. So I've got that 6-digit format with the year of birth in the front. So it just depends who sends the bucket files. And this looks like an All Flex one, but I think it's probably quite an old example given that I've got 2021 from the tag. So they've probably got a more user-friendly format now to their bucket files, but just open it up and have a look at it and see if it makes sense. And if you can identify what the visual tag numbers are printed on those tags, and then just convert it to an appropriate format before you load it onto your XR5000. Otherwise, you're just loading on gobbledygook and it's not going to achieve what you want to achieve. Then you can use this data link program. So you plug your XR5000 into the computer and it will connect. You can see on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, it said it's connected to the XR5000. It then brings up any sessions that are already on that XR5000. So you can see the sessions listed on the left-hand side. And then highlighted in blue, you can also see it's telling you how many animal lifetime information records are already on your XR5000. And this is something to be mindful of, because if you've got 30, 40,000 animal lifetime records on there already from the last 5, 10, 15 years, it will start to really slow down. So if you've got a heap of animal lifetime records on there and you don't know how to tidy that up, perhaps reach out to someone for a bit of tech support, because it will affect the functioning and the speed of your device. But what we want to do, if we've made that nice bucket file for this year's tags, we ask the program to put information onto the device, and we choose to put on animal lifetime information. And then we just follow through the prompts and it will load that bucket file on, and it'll add, essentially, if we'd loaded 1,000 records, it will add 1,000 records to the animal lifetime information count. And it will mean that when you scan those tags, it will already come up as an existing animal. In terms of setting up new sessions on your XR5000, so if you want to go and collect some data today, weigh some animals, for example, you want to set up a new session. So you have to, there's a section on the XR5000 where you go into information to display and record, and that will show you what existing traits already exist on your XR5000. And if you're wanting to record something that you haven't recorded before, you can create a new trait in there. So that's one of the first things you do when you start a new session, go into that information to display and record, and you can tick and untick the boxes next to all those traits so that your weigh screen is displaying what you're wanting to record and it's not displaying what you don't want to record. So it's really easy to see what you've got up there. Also important to note, if you're creating a new trait, it's important to get the right trait type, because you have to nominate what type of trait it is. And the two key options are session data and life data, and they act in slightly different ways. So it's important to use the right type of session. Reproduction or recording reproduction data can be stored as either session data or life data. So think about how you want it to be recalled and displayed before you set up the trait. If you set up something as session data, and often I think of session data as a live weight or a condition score or a fleece weight. They're measures, I suppose, that are taken and they're relevant to that particular day. And that trait can be measured multiple times over the life of an animal. So if you store it as session data, it's really just linked to that one session on the box. It's not you can't easily recall it, at some time next year. You can't easily bring that piece of information up. Whereas a life data trait, you can very easily bring that information back up next year. So with reproduction, I tend to record it as a life data trait. So I can have the last 3 or 4 years worth of reproduction statuses displaying on my screen at the same time, which is just not possible with session data. But naturally, you can't then give that trait the same name each year because you're creating multiple life data traits, but they can't have the same name. So what I tend to do is put a little suffix on that trait for the year. So I might have preg status 21, and then I'll create a new trait, preg status 22, preg status 23, etc. So when you're going through your ewes, you can display their multiple preg statuses over time. So that's the way I prefer to do it. One of my key tips is to make sure that eID, so on that information to display and record section, eID, you can turn it on and off. So if you're just weighing some lambs and you just want to get a bit of a snapshot of the average of the mob, it's quicker to weigh lambs with the eID turned off because it's not waiting for that eID tag to read before it collects the weight and releases the animal. So producers will often turn the eID function off if they're just wanting to get a snapshot of a sub-cohort of the mob. But if you're wanting to collect individual animal data that's important and you're going to use it for analysis and store it against an animal as a valuable life measure, make sure you've got eID turned on. There's nothing more heartbreaking than opening a file of lambs that were weighed or ewes that were weighed at joining time, and it's several months later, and you realise that the eID wasn't turned on, and I actually can't link those weights to an animal. So that's probably one of the key things to really make sure you've got the eID turned on when weighing sheep. And when you're doing drafting, there's options in all these sort of tools to draft sheep, but in the XR 5000 in the setup, you've got different options for, I suppose, recording the ID. So you can basically tell the auto drafter to wait until an eID is received, which can be a little bit of a slow option. Sometimes there'll be animals missing tags, and if you're not paying attention, you'll suddenly realise that you've had the drafter waiting for 5 minutes for an ID, and whoops, I've just wasted all this time. So you can set it up so it waits about 3 to 5 seconds, and if it can't find an ID, it'll draft that sheep off to a different direction you to deal with later, retagging, etc. So there is an option in there to wait for an ID or not. So these are all little things in the setup that help just with the accuracy of recording, because if you're not letting it wait for an ID, you might find that when you open that weight file, there'll be a portion of animals that it hasn't recorded a tag for. And holes in data is always disappointing when it's an important piece of data that you really want to analyse towards the end of the year. A couple of examples now. So this one is about collecting life data at pregnancy scanning. And I really think this is one of the key pieces of data you can collect for not much extra money at all, because you've already got the scanner there. A lot of the scanners should be set up now with panel readers on the side of their scanning crates to be able to record this information for their clients on the day. And if they're not set up with a panel reader and they're not emailing you a file at the end of the day with your eIDs and the pregnancy statuses, put a bit of pressure on them, have that conversation and say, I know I can get pregnancy scanners who can do this for me. You know, have you thought about it? What's holding you back? Because it's really going to save a lot of time if you don't have to run those ewes back through when the scanner leaves and collect that information yourself. So there's 2 ways to go about it. You can collect that data real time at the side of the scanning crate, or the scanner collects it for you. So you could have someone standing there with a stick reader scanning the tags and then entering the pregnancy statuses one at a time as the scanner sprays them and calls it out. And you're going to record that pregnancy status as being dry, single or twin against each animal, or you could record 0, 1, 2 or 3. It just depends what you prefer and what you want as the way you record the pregnancy statuses. I would say have a plan for this so that from year to year you're being consistent. Otherwise you'll end up with an animal that has, single recorded as a word one year and a number 2 the next year, and it's just not very consistent from an analysis perspective. So set those traits up and be consistent. You also obviously can record a stage as a second trait, so an early or late pregnancy in terms of fetal aging. The second option is after the scanner leaves, he's hopefully drafted them into singles and twins and dries. After the scanner leaves, if it hasn't been recorded at the time of scanning, you can set up sessions on your XR 5000 or on your stick reader, run those ewes down the race, scan all their tags, and record the status of those ewes. So you can either set up a session and call it twins and scan all the twins into the session, then set up a session, call it singles and scan all the singles into the session. That requires you to then download those sessions and then do a bit of rejigging to load those back onto the XR5000 under your pregnancy scanning trait, or you can actually set it up so that as you're scanning the tags, it's putting in and recording the pregnancy status directly under the trait. So in the past, I've seen a lot of people just doing the first option where they've called a session singles and filled it up with a heap of tags. Then I've had to then apply the trait with the count in an Excel file and reload it into their XR5000. So it's good to do a little bit of planning beforehand, because as you're scanning those tags, if you can get it to actually put a 2 or a 1 or a 3 or whatever the pregnancy status is, recording under that correct trait at the same time, it just saves that second step and a lot of mucking around. So does your pregnancy scanner have an eID panel fitted to their scanning crate? It's free data. Speak to your scanner. I think it's like anything. It's down to the producers to put a little bit of pressure on their contractors to be providing these services. And if they're not providing these services, I would encourage you to shop around, because this is really free data and it saves you a lot of hassle in the long run trying to collect this, yourself. So I'd really encourage you, and look, I hope there are a lot of scanners getting around that are doing it now, but I'd really encourage you to have that conversation ahead of scanning time to make sure it's an option if you haven't done it before. And then I've got an example about collecting life data at landmarking, because if we think about an animal's productive life, there are a lot of key factors that really, from birth, that can impact an animal's production over time. And we have the ability, most people are putting tags in at landmarkings, we have the ability to capture some of those key life data traits, I suppose, at the landmarking cradle, rather than at weaning time, not knowing if an animal is a twin or a single, not knowing roughly how old they were or which mob they were out of. We've just missed quite a big data collection opportunity. So we've got two options really about collecting data at landmarking. The first one is to collect information real time on the landmarking cradle. So if you're putting those eID tags in, you can have your stick reader on your XR5000 sitting there and you can record individual traits against those lambs. Things like birth type. If you're lambing in twin mobs and single mobs, you can record that lambs are a twin or a single. You can record sexes if it's something you want to be able to draft on at weaning time. You could be recording it on the cradle. Date of birth, just as a rough, if you have quite a spread of lambing, but you've done some fetal aging of your mobs and you know roughly that these ones are my mid-July and these ones are my late July, that's going to impact how heavy they are at weaning time and their growth rates later on. So having an understanding of some of these key impacts would really help later on when we're trying to analyse data. You can also set traits to autofill based on a previous animal. So if this mob of lambs, they're all going to be singles, they're all the same age, they're all out of the same sire group, you can set that up in the XR5000. So all you need to do is scan the tag and it's going to autofill all the previous data that was entered for the previous animal, and then it's only a case of changing the sex if you need to. So it's really handy to do that, setting up to autofill. The second option is to record data in a notebook. So if you don't want to be scanning tags on the landmarking cradle, which a lot of people don't want to be doing, you can record data in a notebook and then bulk import it later onto your XR5000 using Excel. So obviously, within a mob of lambs, the only variable that will be different would be sex. So some people start with their highest tag number or the bag of tags that are the highest and put them in their wethers, and they might start with the lower numbers and put them in their ewes or vice versa. So even though that mob of lambs has different tag numbers or batches of tags within them, when they look in that in Excel, they know, well, all these high tag numbers, I know they're my wethers, and all these low ones I know are my ewes. So that's quite a good strategy for doing that. So what does this look like? This is a little snapshot of a table that one of my producers sent me of his landmarking records. So he's recorded the different paddocks of lambs that were marked, what the estimated lambing date was of those mobs, what age the ewes were in that lambing mob, what their pregnancy status was. So this is giving us the birth type of the lambs in that mob. He's collected a little bit of information for lamb marking percentages. So he's recorded how many ewes were in the mob, how many lambs were in the mob. And then the important thing for recording the life data against those lambs is the start and end tag numbers that he applied to that mob on the lamb marking cradle. So when we get that bucket file and we're trying to match up against the bucket file, who was a single, what age they were, what ewe group were they from, etc. We can basically copy the same information from tag number 1 to tag number 416 because they're all in the same mob. So hopefully that makes sense to everyone. So just a really simple way, and then you go into your spreadsheet and record all that information against your tags. And just finally, on the data collection side of things, a couple of options, 3 options actually, for downloading session files from your XR5000. So we have 3 options for this. The first and easiest is you can insert a USB stick into your XR5000 and it will come up with a little screen where you can tick the sessions that you want to save to the USB, press save, and essentially then you can plug it into the computer and open those sessions or email them. You can connect your XR5000 to the computer using a black data cable and use that data link program to download those sessions. The final option, and this is one that contractors often use because they're wanting to send pregnancy scanning files to producers, as they're leaving the farm, if they've got appropriate connection. There's a data link app on if you've got an iPhone. I'm not sure what happens with Android phones, but on your iPhone, there's a data link app that you can actually connect to the XR5000. And from there, you can download the sessions into an app and then email them. So that is in my experience, it's quite a tricky way to get it all connected. But it's really handy for contractors because I'll get an email, one particular pregnancy scanner. I know when he's just finished pregnancy scanning at a client's property because he'll send me an email will arrive and it's the data files. Bam, here they are. And he hasn't even left their property yet. And as a service provider, I've already received by email the pregnancy scanning data files. So there's different applications, I suppose, for these different methods. The first one is by far the easiest. When you want to get anything off the XR5000, you can generally just use the USB. When you want to put things on, you need to plug it in using that black data cable. Okay, another pause now to see if anyone has any questions relating to the data collection side of things.
Lucy's got a question for us, Elise.
Yeah.
When using the wand, e.g. at land marking, would you generally also have the XR5000 connected nearby, or do you upload from the wand to the XR5000?
Good question. So I'm just going to talk about XR5000 wands because I'm only familiar with those, but there's different models. The most recent model of the XR5000 has the ability to record traits into the wand itself. So it's like a mini computer. The old version of the wands are simply read the eID tag and you can't record anything on the wand. So if you've got an older wand that doesn't have the ability to record onto it, you would have to have your XR5000 there. If you've got a newer model, you could leave the XR5000 at home and use the wand to collect the data. Then yes, Bronwyn, you would have to download it, make sure the headings are correct and pop it back up onto your XR5000. That would be what I would do, probably just to save having the extra device there. Or you can go, look, I'll just set it up so my wand is, even though it's a sophisticated wand, I'm just going to use it to bring the tag up and talk to the XR5000. I'll actually do the recording on the XR5000. So sort of depends on the space, how much table space or 44-gallon drum space you have to have a wand and an XR5000. And it sort of also depends on what model of wand you have and whether it has the capability to record information on it. Because look, it might be easier just recording it on the wand, not having a second device there, and then going back to the office in the evening or when you finish land marking, collate it all with the right headings, and just it's pretty quick to put stuff back onto the XR5000, so it's there for weaning.
Thank you. Hopefully that answers your question, Lucy. If anyone else has got a question, you're welcome to add it to the chat or raise your hand and I can take you off mute.
If you haven't invested yet in wands or in the indicators, there are obviously, a few different options you can go with. I'd always suggest talking to others who use them and getting their feedback on what they think works and what they recommend. Like, obviously, I'm quite an advocate for the True Tester, but I do know people use other systems. So yeah, I'd talk to people and try and see how they work in the yards. It's the same with software programs. See what they look like in the yards on the race side if you're using it for classing, because it is quite an investment to buy these things, and you don't want to buy something and then realize 12 months down the track it's not really the right piece of equipment for me. All right. I'll keep moving, and please, Bronwyn, you can just interrupt me if another question pops in. A little bit now about data collation. I think I've only got a couple of slides, but I suppose there's two options. You can do it yourself in Excel, which is what I do most of the time, or you can use a software program, a commercial software program. So with commercial software programs like the Sapien technology ones or like the Stockbook ones, you should be able to upload your Excel files directly into those programs, or more often than not, they've got like a interface on a laptop that you can have a laptop in the yards if you're not too worried about dust and sheep kicking the laptop. Those programs actually run, on a laptop or a tough book or something to collect the data straight into the program rather than collecting it on an XR5000 and then loading it into the software program afterwards. But you certainly can do that. But I prefer just working in Excel. It's free and I'm pretty comfortable with using it. The first step is to get that eID bucket file. I keep harping on about this, but it's really because the bucket file with the eID and the VID, it just forms the basis of your Excel master file. You can then start putting in columns for the different information that you're recording against those tags. So it starts at landmarking really, with some of that birth data that you record, and then from there on, at weaning time, weights, and when they're adults, pregnancy scans, etc. One of the key steps when you're going to collate data though, and this doesn't matter if you're putting in a software program or if you're putting it in Excel yourself, but you need to open up that session and clean it. I think sessions are getting a lot cleaner now than they used to as people get more comfortable with recording data and they make less mistakes. So I'll show you what a dirty session looks like in a second, but I would always, when you download, you stick your USB stick in there and you download those sessions, save them all in their original format in case you corrupt something down the line and you need to go back to them. Always save them in their original format, but then go through them and look at them, scrutinize them a little bit and clean them before you either merge them into your software program or your Excel file, because there'll be anomalies that you don't want to carry into that file. For example, if you had a look at the range in pregnancy scans in a session and you had some, an animal popped up saying it was scanned as having 5 lambs, you would think, well, that's clearly wrong. It's dirty data that I need to get rid of. And the key formula, I'm just mentioning it. I'm not going to go through it or give an example of how to do it because it's a whole new webinar in itself. But the key formula that I use for collating data in Excel is called VLOOKUP. So if you haven't tried to use VLOOKUP before, but you're pretty handy in Excel, Google it. I sort of self-learned this one, but I did have a team of people around using it, so they were able to point me in the right direction. And there are different formulas as well, but VLOOKUP's the one that I use, and I haven't really had any severe limitations to using it. So it's a really nifty one that, you've collected data on 100 animals today and you want to go and transfer that data and store it into your master file, which could have thousands of animals. It's just a really quick way of quickly collating those new pieces of data and storing them under the right animal. So VLOOKUP, for those who are quite Excel savvy, is the one to be learning how to use if you don't have a method for collating data already. So here's a dirty session file, and this is a pregnancy scanning one that I opened up, and immediately I can see a couple of lines of data that don't look right. The second animal there doesn't actually have a tag at all stored against that pregnancy scan, so it just means it's not going to go anywhere. So sometimes you'll realize that the animal with a tag beforehand is missing data, and you'll think, okay, look, the second animal actually belongs to the first animal and you can move it. In this case, it looks like there was just a bit of a malfunction with the reader and no tag was recorded, or maybe it's the same animal as that third animal, which clearly doesn't have an eID tag, and the scanner has typed in a manual visual tag to record that pregnancy scan against. So something's gone wrong. We've got a line with no ID at all against it. So I would just delete that record. And then we've got a couple of animals that their eID tag was missing, and the scanner has recorded the visual ID in there. So I wouldn't delete those ones, but I need to be mindful that if I'm going to be using the eID column, which I normally am, using the eID column to transfer those pregnancy scans into my software program or into my Excel master file, I need to be mindful that the animals that don't have an eID recorded, they're not going to get transferred across. So I'm going to have to go back manually afterwards and find those animals. And then if I've got visual IDs, which I do hopefully stored in my master file, I can match them up to those animals. So just something to be mindful of is just scrolling through your session data. Are there any anomalies there or animals that I'm going to have to match up myself? And there is a concept that I haven't put in the slides, but if you're doing that VLOOKUP formula, I call it reverse VLOOKUP, and it essentially means when I use the formula to put these pregnancy scans in my master file, I want to count how many records have been transferred across and look, does the number of records that I've transferred across match the number of records that I collected? And if it doesn't match, that means some of them haven't transferred across. And I do what I call a reverse VLOOKUP, where I then come into this session file of pregnancy scanning data, and I'll just add in a new column there, and I'll actually do a VLOOKUP and look, do those tag numbers all exist in my master file? And it might be a case that a few sheep were re-tagged on this day and that eID doesn't currently exist in my master file or in my software program. So then I'll have to add those individual animals in. So it's just something to be mindful. Does the number of records that have been transferred across into my master file match the number of records that I've got in my session file? And if they don't, let's try and work out which animals haven't transferred across because they're new tags that I haven't seen before, and I want to start recording them and including them in that data set. That's, I suppose, a tip or trick that, yeah, make sure those numbers match so that you're not accidentally leaving out animals that have suddenly appeared, been re-tagged, and you do want to add them in. This is a little snapshot of what a master file might look like. So we're starting off with the eIDs and VIDs from our bucket file. Then we can create whatever custom traits we want to record against our animals. So for this flock, we've got the drop. And this is because over time, you'll end up with lots of different drops of animals. And you might want to look at some analysis over time where you're looking at the pregnancy scanning results of different age groups of ewes. So we need to have that age or that drop as a variable in there so that when we're analysing it later on, and I've probably got a few examples later on, the breakdown of the different year groups, we can analyse it that way. The birth status, so where they're born as a twin, where they're born as a single, etc. Any genetic information we have that we think is important. So which ewes are they from? Are they from a mature ewe? Are they from a maiden or a ewe lamb? It could be important when we're analysing it later on, just to make sure we're comparing apples with apples, because if we're classing our replacement ewes, we want to know, are they out of a mature ewe or out of a ewe lamb? Because, there'll be a bit of a handicap from being out of a ewe lamb. They're going to be younger, but at the same vein, they'll be hopefully of higher genetic merit. So we really want to compare apples with apples. Then I've got a couple of examples of pregnancy scans from 2 different years. One's from 2023 and one's from 2024. And for these ewes, they've had not only a pregnancy scan recorded, but they've also had a cycle. So they conceived early in the first cycle, or they a late lammer to conceive in the second cycle. So this is just information that has been collected, and then we have to decide what to do with it, essentially. Next pause for any questions on the data collation. It's probably one of the areas that people have the most questions about, because it's often a stumbling block for people that collected a lot of data and don't quite know how to go about the next step. But if there's any questions, please ask.
Got another question for you, Elise. Can you set up a lifetime session templates on the XR 5000 for different enterprises, e.g. cattle, stud sheep, fat lambs?
Yeah, you can. In terms of, like, some traits will be the same, Bronwyn. So, something like drop, that trait name will be the same. Pregnancy scan 2025 won't matter if it's a, a stud ewe, a flock ewe, or a cow, that's still going to be the same trait name. So you don't need to, call it pregnancy scan cattle 2025. I just call it the same name, use the same trait heading across those different classes of animals. And when you download the sessions that have those relevant animals to that breed or that flock in it, it will only obviously contain those animals in the file. So I don't think there's any necessity to create a different trait name if it means the same thing and use it across different livestock classes, unless obviously a trait is completely unique to that class. So you might only be recording fleece traits in your self-replacing nucleus, breeding nucleus of merino ewes. You wouldn't be recording them in your crossbreds or in your cattle. So obviously it's only going to be that class of animals that has that type of data recorded against it. But I don't think it's necessary to have a different trait if it's the same name for different livestock classes. Hope that makes sense. But if there's a specific example, feel free to send that through. Bronwyn can pass it on and I can provide a little bit of feedback. So onto data analysis. I've got quite a few examples to show of, I suppose, the output, the analysis. What does it look like? There's a couple of key things I do with analysis. And I just want to be upfront and say I don't really do at all statistical analysis. So I'm not a statistician. So I'm not looking at, these animals are statistically growthier or statistically more fertile. There's nothing statistical about my analysis. It's all based on summary statistics. So looking at the distribution in a mob and the variation of an animal from that average of the mob. One of the handiest tools that I've learned, and if you haven't learnt about pivot tables, they're a bit confusing and they are, worth a separate workshop. But pivot tables are an amazing tool that once I learned how to do them, my mind was blown because they're just such a quick way of getting some summary statistics in Excel. And I've got a couple on the next slide to show you very quickly what a pivot table looks like. Also graphing. Graphs are quite handy to give you some visual representation of trends. And I often start with a pivot table to get those average values across different livestock classes or ages, for example. And then once I've got those summary statistics, then I can graph them. So I'll show you what they look like. In analysis, I'm also doing things like indexing animals. So either trying to rank them and just giving them a rank or some kind of an index that ranks them, and assigning classing grades or draft codes. So trying to work out where animals rank amongst their peers, or something like drafting codes might be for lambing time. I've already recorded if sheep are singles or twins or they're earlies or late. So that just becomes, you can draft on, there's lots of different ways you can draft on an Excel 5000. You can draft on an individual trait. So you can just set it up to draft on single or twin, or you can do a more complex rules-based drafting where you could say, I want my early singles this way, I want my early twins that way. So there's lots of different ways you can use drafting. Lifetime reproduction is also a way that I will try and rank animals. So lifetime reproduction is looking at over multiple joining opportunities. How did these ewes respond? Which ewes conceived singles back to back? Which ones conceived twins back to back? Which ones had a bit of a fluctuation from one year to the next? So you can work out which animals are fitting into each category. So I'm just going to show you some pivot tables now. I love pivot tables. So if you want to know more about how to do them, I'm not going to do a demo now, but I'm just showing you what they look like. Basically, when you've got your master file and you've got a whole heap of columns, those columns or trait names, they're all an option for how you can put them in the table. So in the first table, I've got a few different variables. I've got the mob that the ewes were at scanning time. There was 4 mobs on the day. So I've got an AI mob, I've got a fat mature mob, I've got a fat purple mob, and I've got a shedder mob. So these are often just the descriptive names that the producer will give the scanner. And then I've got the pregnancy status along the top. So whether they were scanned with 0, 1, 2, or 3. So those traits I've been able to drag and drop into the pivot table. And it is a funny tool that you just drag and drop different traits through rows and columns and things, and then you look at it, it changes as you drag and drop them around, and you eventually go, no, that's not what I want. Drag it around, drop it around, and go, that's what I want. So you just have a bit of a play and you get a feel for how you want the data to be presented, but I've set it up so I've got the counts of the animals in each of those categories. So for my AI use, I've got the counts of the dry singles, twins, and triplets. You can set it up to display percentages rather than counts. So it might tell me, I've got 10% or 5% of the sheep in that category. So there's a lot of different ways you can display it. So this is quite, I can, and then I've got different variables. So within those 4 mobs of sheep, I then changed it. In the second table, I've got rid of whether they were a twin, a single, or a triplet, or a dry, and I've put in whether they were an early or a late, just so we've got a bit of a feel for how many early lambers and late lambers we're going to have in those different mobs. To put a third criteria into a table is possible. So if I wanted to have earlies and lates and the pregnancy scan and the mobs, it's possible, but it just does make a very messy table. It's quite difficult to interpret. So I often break it down just using 2 traits at the beginning, so it's not too confusing. And then on the third table, you can see I've disregarded what mob they're in, and I've dragged the early and late or the cycle down into the rows. So I'm now looking at overall, regardless of which mob they're in, how many early singles do I have? How many late twins do I have? So the producer can look at this and plan how many paddocks he's going to need for lambing time based on those different cohorts of animals. That's what the pivot table interface looks like in Excel. But then I don't send those pivot tables to the producer. What I do is I extract from them manipulate them, I suppose, into a table. So I tease from those pivot tables the bits of information that I want, and I present it back to the producer in a table like this, where I've got the different mobs, the counts of the ewes in them, the counts of those dry singles, twins, and triplets. So if he does want to lamb them in their separate mob, if they want to keep those 4 mobs separate, he can. What proportion of the ewes are scanned early, which is, it's money for the producer if he can get ewes to conceive in the first cycle. That's worth a lot more money because at weaning time, those lambs are a couple of weeks older and heavier, and the ewes have got better chance of recovery for joining. This is my normal little repro summary that I'll give back to a producer. So I'll give him the proportion of early scans if the scanner has scanned early and late. I'll compute fertility. Fertility is essentially, did they get pregnant or not? So the best fertility you can get in a mob is everyone gets pregnant, which would be 100%. So he was getting, roughly 2 dries per 100 ewes in those naturally joined mobs. And the reproduction rate, which is a function of how many fetuses in total did we have relative to ewes joined. So it does include the dries. And often you do want to scan for triplets if you've got a higher reproduction rate, because there'll be quite a few triplets in there. I'm not sure where the sweet spot is, Bronwyn, but there is a number that industry recommends if you're scanning over, might be 120%, 130%, or 150%. I can't remember what it is, but if you're just twin scanning and you're scanning over that level, and I don't know what it is, but it's basically you should be scanning for triplets once you hit a certain threshold, because there probably will be quite a few in there. And once you start scanning for triplets, your reproduction rate number will get a lot higher. If he just twin scanned, we wouldn't know about all those extra triplets. So you look at the reproduction rate and go, bloody hell, that's high. It's partly high because he has scanned for triplets and picked up all those extras. So if he hadn't, he would have probably had numbers, it would have been under 200, it'd have to be under 200%. So, scanning for triplets and understanding how many there are in there is quite important, because it's potential that you're not realising if you don't know it's there to be realised. And in terms of a graph, so this example coming up is a graph, and it's not of the same data set. So it's not, don't compare it to that table, but this is a ewe lamb data set where we've got some live weights of the ewe lambs along the bottom. So I've used a pivot table to basically get the summary statistics of those different weight categories. And the statistics I've taken are the pregnancy rate, the scanning percentage, and the early conception, which are the 3 key reproduction outcomes that I'm measuring. How did they vary across those live weight categories? So sometimes looking at things on a graph helps you to identify trends and differences easier than it does in a table. Some people prefer tables. Sometimes you can do both. But this is a visual representation just to show that as the live weight increases, if we look at the green bars, the early conceptions are increasing. If we look at the blue bars, there's a little bit of a trend there that they're, more ewes are getting pregnant. And then the red bar, which is overall how many, what was the reproduction rate, how many fetuses per 100 ewes, we can see that's increasing as well. But, why might a producer want this data? One of the key reasons why is because for ewe lambs, we're trying to work out what our live weight targets are at joining. And everyone's sheep are different. Everyone's management is different. Everyone's genetics are different. So it's really important to understand how do my genetics respond? What are the targets that I should be aiming for with my genetics and my management? So this was a really good way for a producer to screen how many animals are there. There's probably about 800, 800 or 900 lambs in that mob. What should my live weight target be next year? So we look at somewhere around the 45 to 50 kilo mark. There's a little bit of a plateauing off in terms of the rate of, certainly the pregnancy rate starts to plateau off. There's still a few more fetuses being achieved. But under 45 kilos, we're really not doing as well. So that's sort of, from this data set, this producer was able to go, look, I'm really going to try and set 45 as my minimum live weight for joining ewe lambs next year, because I can see I'll get a really good result of 45 kilos plus. And the ones that are lighter, they're really going to be penalised. So either I've got to grow them faster to get the tail end up to 45 kilos, or I just won't join them and I'll allocate that feed and resources to the ones that are going to hit 45 kilos. So this is a really good exercise with a weight, and ideally you'd take a weight at joining. This was one of those cases where we hadn't planned ahead and we didn't have a weight until pregnancy scanning. So this is a pregnancy scanning weight. But ideally you get a weight at joining and a pregnancy scan at pregnancy scanning linked to the individual eID tag, and you can get this data for yourself to help guide your decisions. This is a table showing how you might track successive reproduction. So this is just year on year, so 2 years in a row. I've broken it down. The rows are by age cohort of the ewes, and then I've got the counts of ewes that have scanned with back-to-back singles. Then on the right-hand side, back-to-back multiples, and then the two columns in the middle, they had a combination of a single followed by a multiple or vice versa. So this producer said, look, I want to get rid of some ewes. I've got too many ewes. Rather than just get rid of my oldest age group of ewes, 2014 drop ewes, this was probably back in 2020 or something. It's quite an old data set. But rather than just quit the oldest age group of ewes, there are some really productive ewes. There's 211 of those oldest ewes have had twins back to back. So rather than just quit that age group, why don't I look at the least productive ewes across all age groups? So rather than get rid of 368 red tag ewes, why don't we get rid of the 303 ewes across all age groups that have had a single back-to-back? So that was probably the strategy that was employed by this producer, based on just having 2 pregnancy scanning records across his whole ewe flock at that time. So hopefully that would improve his scanning result the next year, because he's keeping his most productive and fertile ewes in the flock. I think that's a really simple way to present data, and really just flips the way you're thinking about productivity, because those old girls, if they're still functional, can have a lot of lambs. And this is an example of a little snapshot, and it's quite an old example as well, ranking ewes on total production. So this had some pregnancy scanning information, a fleece weight, and a computation of a gross annual income based on those 2 metrics. So it was assumed that if a ewe scanned with twins or scanned with a single, it was assumed that there would be obviously some losses from lamb survival. So they weren't assigned 2 full lamb values. They were assigned sort of based on what the mob averages were for survival. They might have been, if there was 80% survival in the twins, they would be assigned, 1.6 lambs worth of value and just the average lamb value. Obviously, we don't know exactly which lambs they reared, but we're able to tease apart the estimated value of production that those ewes have brought to the flock over those 2 years, and then what was the average production for those 2 years. So we're able to now get, if we focus on the average production for those 5 ewes over 2 seasons, we're able to really tease apart the value that those ewes are bringing to the flock. So even though there are a few assumptions made in here about averaging effects of lamb values and lamb growth and things, we're able to really tease apart, from $230 worth of estimated value to only $120 of estimated value. So if you had 1,000 ewes in your flock and you've got this huge range in estimated values, even though they're not 100% accurate, it's still a lot of variation there that you can draft off the bottom performing ewes after a couple of seasons and really get rid of them and focus on the more productive ewes. So it's an ongoing computation with this flock that year on year we're adding in those estimated annualized values of production. It's quite a cool way to look at it, start putting some numbers around it. And I've got a pause for questions before I move on. So if anyone has any questions about the analysis side of things, hopefully it's not too overwhelming. But I've just tried to give a few ideas of what you can do with the data and how you can make it look to try and get your head around and create some numbers in ways that you can rank animals, ways that you can work out who's performing, ways that you can categorize sheep for drafting or for selection.
We have got a question. Can you clarify what GFW stood for in that last graph?
Yeah, I can. Yep. So GFW is greasy fleece weight. So these flock weighs the ewes fleeces every year. There's no fiber test results, but there's a fleece weight. So we know exactly how many kilos of wool each of the ewes cut. We know how many lambs she scanned with. We don't know how many she reared. If this flock does wet and dry, so if a ewe is dry at lamb marking, she's assigned a 0. Obviously, if she scanned with 2 but is dry, too bad, she's assigned a 0 and she gets nothing for the lamb production. If she's scanned with a single, we assume that she has reared the average survival of the single mods because their lamb is single, so it might be 90%. So we'll assign her, the lamb marking survival is 90%, we'll assign her 0.9 of a lamb at whatever the average lamb value is, and the same with the twins. If they've had an 80% survival, we'll assign them 1.6 times the average lamb value. So the fleece is more accurate because we do have an individual fleece weight. The value of the fleece is just obviously the average that was returned for that mob when we sold the fleece's average price per kilo. So that is a bit more accurate than the lamb side of things, but certainly a twin, regardless of how big the twins are, is generally going to return more value than a single. That's what GFW is, greasy fleece weight.
Another question asking if you've heard of the Backyards app.
I haven't, no. If someone wants to mention what that is, welcome to.
Yeah, you're welcome to add some more details in the chat if you like, Jessie, and we'll look into it.
I haven't heard of the Backyards app. What apps have I heard of? I've heard of Mobble. I haven't had experience using any apps, but I've heard of Mobble. I've heard of, oh gosh, I can't remember what it's called now. It's a main one, AgriWeb. I don't know if that's an app or I think it's an app, AgriWeb. There are certainly so many things out there to play around with. I haven't played around with any of them, I must confess. There is also, I don't know if it's a lifetime ewe management app. I don't know who made the app, but there is an app for condition scoring as well. So you can, as you're going up the race, if you're not wanting to record it against eIDs and you're just wanting to get a bit of a snapshot of how mob's performing, there's a condition scoring app too, but I don't have that one either. Okay, how are we going for time? Not too bad. All right. So probably the biggest section and the most important section is this implementation and decision making. And oftentimes my job is all the stuff I've sort of talked about in the middle. So producers are pretty good at data collection. I'm pretty good at on the phone helping them set stuff up and helping them with tech issues. And then I generally work in the data collation and the data analysis space. That's where I do most of my stuff. And then I handball stuff back to producers and they do the implementation and decision making. So they will do the drafting, they will do the ultimate animal selection and put sheep on trucks, make bookings with processors, etc. So the implementation decision making has a few different aspects. I'm just going to go through a heap of examples really. So what do we want to do in Excel or in our software program? We want to generate indexes or assign classing grades or draft codes to animals. So that's the sort of output that producers need from their software, from their master file, because then they can make some decisions. They've actually decided this is my threshold. Any animal under this threshold is going to be culled, or any animal over this threshold, they're going to go into my replacement breeding nucleus, for example. To be able to help make those decisions and implement it, we need to load those new traits onto the XR5000. So if we've got a new index or we've got a classing grade or a draft code that we've come up with in Excel, we then need to put that onto our XR5000 because that will help us to then perform the draft, basically implementing what we've done in the office. Then we want to draft based on animal selection decisions or our management targets. We can draft, as I mentioned before, on single or multiple traits, or we can do really complex rules-based drafting. So sometimes I've helped people set up rules that if an animal is within a certain weight range and it's out of a certain sire, or it's, you know, different combinations of complex rules. And then I'll whip through a few examples now because I think that'll make it more relevant for everyone and hopefully can identify with one of these examples. So I have touched a bit on reproduction management, and it's essentially about understanding how your genetics respond. So with mature ewes, condition score is a really handy tool and target for measuring how your ewes, I suppose, are responding to condition score in terms of their reproduction. We know that putting more condition on ewes will result in more pregnancies and more fetuses. In ewe lambs, it's probably primarily live weight. So we really want to understand in our maidens and our ewe lambs, what are our live weight targets for getting good reproduction rates, and what are those metrics that we want to measure in reproduction. There's those three that I talked about earlier. So did they get pregnant? What was their pregnancy rate? What was the overall reproductive rate or scanning percentage? And looking at early conception, particularly in mature ewes, we really want to try and get as many ewes pregnant in the first cycle as possible. It's worth a lot more money. And then we can use the data that we've collected to set some targets for next year. So whether it's setting some condition score targets for our mature ewes, and understanding that rather than setting a target of 3 for condition score, which might be what industry recommends, we know that with our genetics, if we set it as 3.3, we're actually going to be in the sweet spot where we're getting a lot more production for not much more extra condition. So have those targets that are really specific to your genetics. And that other example I showed you before, for that particular flock, he had decided, based on the data, he was going to set 45 kilos as a minimum joining weight for ewe lambs for next year. And this is a similar, it's a different cohort of animals. You can see this is the 2019 drop of ewe lambs rather than the 2016 drop, but it's the same producer. And I presented the data pretty much in the same way. There are still some light ones in there, actually a lot of light ones in there. But I've also put the table underneath because on the graph, you've got the option to tick a little box and have a little summary table underneath, which I only discovered in recent years. I started adding it in because I quite like it just to see those numbers. It's easier than trying to look across the line and work out what those numbers are. So again, sort of that 45 kilos was really the sweet spot because we're starting to get 90% and above of the ewe lambs pregnant. We were getting a really good scanning percentage of 144 fetuses per 100 ewes. And we were getting sort of 85% of them pregnant in the first cycle, which is exceptional for ewe lambs. I would kind of tend to ignore that last group of bars because as you can see with the number of animals above the red bar, we only had 3 really heavy ones in there. So this, you know, this year might have been a bit of a wasted opportunity because this is a flock that we had been measuring over, well, certainly from 2016, and we knew our targets back in 2016 were about 45 kilos. And you can see he only had 87 plus 3, so he only had 90 of his ewe lambs that had met his historical target, and you can see just how much the reproduction has dropped off. Still quite good, these were composites, still quite good with the lighter weights, but you can just see the missed opportunity, I suppose, in terms of we knew we needed 45 kilos, and those larger ones still had good results, but we have missed the opportunity. So it's still an interesting exercise to do every few years with those two data points, the live weight and the pregnancy scan, which don't cost much to collect, just to check, over time, your genetics and your management do subtly change. So just to check, are those targets still the appropriate targets for my flock, or have they shifted and I need to shift in response? So it's still good to do this exercise every few years and just check that those targets are still lining up with what you're observing the response to be. Here's an example of assessing different genetics. So when I talked about, you've got a current ram team or a current ram supplier, should we be, considering somewhere else? Are we buying rams with breeding values? Are we buying rams with accurate breeding values? So this is an example where a producer has, I suppose, is challenging what they're currently doing and saying to Dad, I'd like to try something different. So we've got a sire line of what his traditional ram source is that he's always been using and buying. And then he has sourced some new rams from two different studs, a WA stud and a New South Wales stud. So we've got three different sire lines there, a traditional one and then the two new ones. And then we started to measure the performance of these different rams. So we've got the scanning percentage of the ewes that were joined to those three different sires. And again, none of this is statistically analysed. So these might just be little differences due to who knows what, but very little difference in the scanning percentage. I would say without statistically analysing it, they're not all that different. They're sort of hovering around 140% scanning percentage. And then we have analysed the marking percentage and the lamb survival of those lambs from those ewes joined to those different sires. And we can see the survival in the singles is quite different between the traditional ram source and the other two, with the other two being pretty similar. And the survival in the twins varies a bit between all three groups, with the traditional ones being the lowest and the New South Wales ones being the highest. And overall, if we combine the singles and the twins, we end up with these differences in the lamb survival. And we've obviously got to acknowledge that there'll be different paddocks that these sheep have been in, because to keep the sire lines different, they need to be paddocked out separately for lambing through to lamb marking. So this might be something that this producer, to set it up properly, wants to have multiple mobs of each ram source just to try and alleviate any differences in paddock effects. But there's certainly, without knowing the history of what paddocks and how many mobs there were, there is certainly, the data is showing a difference in lamb survival. We've then collected some data on the weaning weights of these lambs, and bear in mind that once they've got a tag put in at marking time, ideally you mix all those different progeny from the different sires together so they're managed similarly through to weaning. So from the eIDs, we can then separate the data back out again at weaning time and know who's who. So we've got average weaning weights of the progeny of those three different sires. And just to bear in mind that there's obviously going to be more twins in the New South Wales mob than the WA mob compared to the traditionals, because of that differences in lamb survival. So I've computed, next to the average weaning weights, a value of the proportion of twins, just so that you're bearing in mind, I suppose, irrespective of the increased proportion of twins, we're still getting a heavier weaning weight in the New South Wales sire-lined lambs. So it's sort of the opposite of what you'd expect. You'd expect if there's more singles that they'd probably be heavier, but we've got a genetic influence coming through where, though they're probably, there are definitely more twins, they're still growing faster and they're heavier. That's at weaning. WWT is weaning weight. And then we've got a post-weaning weight, which is some point after weaning. And I haven't put the actual weight in, but I've got a growth rate. So I've got a post-weaning growth rate. So this is between weaning and this period afterwards where we've weighed them. What was a growth rate in grams per day of the lambs from those different mobs? And you'd expect that if lambs are lighter and there's more twins, they would grow faster, because you get this compensatory growth of young, particularly twins, where once they're weaned and they're getting on to potentially better nutrition and more nutrition and better availability to nutrition, not having to compete with their twin, they start to gather a bit of speed. So we've certainly seen a really high growth rate post-weaning in those WA ones, and the growth rate is actually lowest in the New South Wales ones. So is this a concern? The growth rate is probably partly lower because they started off being heavier anyway. So they didn't have to compensate as much because they were already quite ahead of the mob. But most importantly, what is that final outcome this producer is looking for? He was wanting to join his ewe lambs. So that final box down the bottom, EL is ewe lambs. What percentage of the ewe lambs born from these different size groups were joined? So he had a minimum live weight, whether it was 40 or 45 kilos, whatever his minimum was, he set. What proportion of the ewe lambs achieved that growth rate? So that's that joining weight, sorry. That's a function of how heavy they were at weaning and how fast they grew afterwards. And we actually see that after all these different time points and all the bits and bobs that we've collected, the sire line that really hit his ultimate target of being able to join as a ewe lamb were the WA ones, which were a bit more moderate at weaning weight, but had a really good growth rate after weaning, and they smashed the target for smashed the other two mobs in terms of the proportion that were joined as a ewe lamb. So this is just one example of how you can collect some different pieces of information to work out how different genetic sources can perform. And I'm pretty confident in saying, I don't know which bloodline he ended up settling on, but I think he gradually phased out the original genetics that they had and moved towards something a bit more modern. But equally, you might come up with the outcome that your genetic source you're on already is performing really, really well. And that's still a good outcome because you can then confidently continue in the direction that you're already going. Classing replacements on data. So I'll go through this fairly quickly, but we've collected some stuff at landmarking about the birth status of lambs. It's important to do that because we want to compare apples with apples. When we're classing maidens around hogget age, we really want to know who's a single or a twin, particularly important in wool producing flocks because the birth status in utero, whether an animal's a single or a twin, it really does impact the wool production potential of that animal and the development of their wool follicles in utero. So it's not a genetic thing, but it does mean that, the singles will have an advantage over the twins in terms of their wool production. Won't be genetic, but you would potentially be can't think of the word, biasing, I suppose, your selection towards singles, thinking that they've got better genetic wool production, but they actually don't. It's an environmental thing due to them being born a single. So you want to separately class your singles and your twins wherever possible, so you're comparing apples with apples. In terms of growth rates, if you're wanting to class your replacements on data, you can calculate growth rates quite simply by having two weights that have a date stamp against them. That will give you a growth rate. You can calculate growth rates instantaneously on your XR5000 if you just tick the little box to say calculate growth rates, or you can go into Excel and do it yourself. I'll show you that on the next slide. And remember, like the example on the previous slide with those different bloodlines, it's not only about weight on a given day, it's also about growth rates. So twin-born lambs are often weaned lighter, but they have this compensatory growth after weaning. So you really want to give them the opportunity to compensate for being a twin and show their performance after weaning. And with fleece data, you can collect for classing a body weight, fleece weights, and or fibre test data. And there's a handy tool, which I think I've got a slide of, called Rampower for merinos, where you can put that raw data into a ranking tool and it will give you indexes and ranks for your animals across that flock. So that's a really handy tool I'll show you. This is a quick one on calculating growth rates. So we've got a sub-cohort of data here where we've got a weaning date and a weaning weight, and then we've got a post-weaning date and a post-weaning weight. Then you can do a couple of calculations. What are the number of days between those two weighing opportunities? And there's 58 days. And you go, okay, how many kilos are they grown? And if I divide that by how many days, we end up with grams per day. So we can see there's quite a bit of variation in the growth rates of those, the post-weaning growth rates in the second last column there, and grams per head per day between those two weight points. And obviously I haven't got on here whether they're a twin or a single, but that just adds in another variable. So when we're classing, we make sure, or when we're ranking them, we might rank all the singles and compare singles with singles, and then we might rank all the twins and compare twins with twins. And then I've computed what I call a post-weaning growth decile in the final column. So if the top 10% of animals, ones in the top 10% for growth rate, get a number 1. The next 10% get a number 2. And the ones in the 30th percentile get a number 3, etc., etc. So if they get a number 10, they're in the bottom 10%. So that's just a way of visually and kind of crudely, but visually ranking, simplifying a little bit and ranking those animals into their different deciles. So you can quickly see who's in the top, do they rank in the top 70% or in the top 20%. Then when we're trying to class animals and we've got a specific proportion in mind that we want to class out, this is an example where I've got the weight, so the actual live weight of the animals on the left-hand side of the table, what group they're in. I've just grouped them into 5 kilo brackets. And then I've got their yearling in this example, yearling growth rate decile. So between 2 measures, 2 weights taken, 22nd of March to the 10th of September, how many grams per head per day did they grow in that period? And I've split them into the 10 deciles. So the ones that are in column 1, they're the ones that grew the fastest, the top 10% of growthiest lambs. So I've got these 2 variables now that I want to class on. It's not just about how heavy they are at yearling time, but also how did they get there? Did they eat a lot of food and not really grow? Or did they actually do something productive with the food that I was feeding them? So we've sort of given 3 different rankings, tops, middles, or seconds, I should call them, and thirds. So the yellow ones that are highlighted in yellow, these are the animals that were over 50 kilos at yearling, which was our ultimate live weight that we wanted. And they were also in the top 80% for the growth rate. So they're decile 1 to 8. So those animals, there's 198 of them. They're called our tops. And then we've got middle. So the second ones, we went down to 45 kilos. So they're not quite as good. So we went down to 45 kilos, and we also included if they had achieved 50 kilos, but they were a bit slower growing. We thought, well, they probably were slower growing because they were already quite big. So we didn't want to penalize them too much. So we called them our seconds, and there were 103 ewes in that category. And the ones that we've instantly classed out are our thirds, and these are the ewes that were less than 45, I should say, kilos straight out, or if they were less than 50 and in the lower 2 ranking deciles. So this is just showing how I've worked out which ewes go into which class. And then we also want to check that we're not unfairly penalising or biasing the data set against our twins. So I just did a quick little summary table down the bottom to look at the singles and twins, what their averages were for yearling weight and growth rate, and what proportion of them ended up being classed into our tops, seconds, and thirds. Because I didn't, in this summary table, analyze singles and twins separately. I just wanted to make sure, was I unfairly biasing the twins? And this summary table down the bottom showed me, no, I wasn't unfairly biasing the twins, because I had roughly equal proportions of twins and singles going to my tops, my seconds, and my thirds. So I was comfortable that the twins and singles were having equal opportunity to be classed in. So if you ended up with vastly different proportions, it would be a red flag that maybe I need to do 2 different summaries, and I need to firstly just look at the twins and class them. So I've got a roughly the same proportion, and then class the singles separately, and then bring the overall results together. So I might have different targets, slightly different targets for my twins to compensate for the fact that they're a twin, but I didn't need to in this example. So that's just an important thing to consider. This is the RAM power analysis. So for anyone who's got merinos, this tool exists. It's freely available for service providers. It's a sheep genetics developed tool. So you can approach a sheep genetics service provider to use this tool for you. But basically you can collect raw data, and you can see those columns I through to T on the right-hand side. There's some raw data that has been used. We've got a weight of the animals, a fleece weight, and then we've got some wool test results. And you can also put a fat and muscle scan in here, I believe, but I don't know any commercial producers who are fat and muscle scanning, so I've left it out. But essentially a live weight, a fleece weight, and fibre tests taken at the same time or same age stage. So you don't want a weight from weaning and then fibre test data from yearling. You want it to be roughly at the same age. And then you can put it through this tool, and you can choose, these are based on the old sheep genetics merino select indexes. So you can choose from MP, MP plus, DP, DP plus, and FP and FP plus. If you're familiar with those indexes, they've got different breeding objectives behind them. So you can choose which indexes you want to use, and what it will do is it will index the animals just within this management group. So you want all the animals to be the same age and the same management. So you don't want it to be from different properties or different times of birth. You want them all to be the same. It will basically index the animals for you and then rank them. So it will, for those different indexes, the animals will rank differently because they've got a different breakdown of growth versus fleece in them. The indexes are based around the average of the mob being 100, and then the better than average animals will have an index higher than 100 and vice versa. And the magnitude of how much higher or lower than 100 they are is obviously reflective of their superiority. So you will find that you'll have animals that rank quite highly across a range of indexes, and they're probably the animals that are safe bet. You'll have conversely animals that are really, really high for one index, but not so high for others. So it is important to choose the right index for your breed that's most closely aligned to your breeding objective. Otherwise, you could be ranking your animals on the wrong index and lastly changing your selection decisions as a result. Okay, as a final slide, my key points for success when using eID. So I think I've mentioned it before, but really define your target data management output before you start collecting data, because it takes time and money to collect data, and it can get quite overwhelming if you don't have a plan behind it and you just collect a heap of stuff. Focus on the relevance to your breeding objective or your business objective, your profit drivers. Focus on your data management calendar. Make sure all the data is analysed. And you're using it. That's one of the most important things. If you're not going to use it, there's not so much point collecting it. And you can use it for animal selection, for management decisions, or practice change. So practice change, for example, is realizing I actually need to change the target that I have for my live weight for joining my ewe lambs. Practice change might be realizing I think I need to change my ram team or my ram source. Start small, I think, is my other key point. Ease into things. If you haven't done something before, just take a small, manageable starting point. Don't try and do everything. Learn how to do some data collation and analysis, or realize, I suppose, that you need a bit of help. Seek assistance if you're bogged down. If you've collected a heap of stuff and you're just stuck in the collection phase, which does happen a lot because you don't have the confidence or the time or the skills to progress, seek some assistance so that you don't just keep collecting. There also is potential for sharing equipment. And I did mention, go out and see what your neighbours and your friends are using and ask if you can just come along and have a look when they're using it. So you can familiarise yourself with it and work out if it's what you need. But there's also potential to share gear if you want to help with the startup costs. And then once you, I suppose, get into the cycle of sharing, you realise how difficult it is. You'll probably end up getting your own, but at least you'll be familiar with what you're using and I suppose happy with the company that you've been using before you go and buy your own. So they're my key take homes. And I'm going to leave it there, but the rest of the session is just opened up for questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Elise. That's incredibly comprehensive, particularly for a Friday afternoon.
It is a bit, yeah.
Yeah, you're welcome to add some questions into the chat if you like, or you can raise your hand and I'm happy to take you off mute. We've got one question while we get started, Elise. Another one around the data collection. Do you add 1 year's bucket list to the bottom of last year's, or do you create a new worksheet or workbook each year?
Yep, so I very much keep everything in one file. So I add. And just because you're going to end up with data sets like pregnancy scanning data, where you're going to have multiple age groups, and I would hate to have to go into my 2017 bucket file and let's add in the pregnancy scanning from 2017, and now I have to go into my 2018 file, and I hate that. It would be very hard to analyze as well, because you could only ever analyze one age group at a time. So I would put it all in the one. And then over time, as this file gets larger and larger and larger, you'll be having ewes that drop out of your breeding flock all the time. So you've got the ability to create a trait, which is status, I often call it, where you can have current or gone, dead, sold, whatever. So you can actually fill in if animals have been sold or died, they've missed their stock take, they've clearly disappeared from the system, you can mark a status against them. So when you're doing analysis, you're just analysing your current use, or you can actually just delete out or cut and paste them into some archived Excel file, animals that are no longer in your flock anymore, and you assume they're dead, but if they suddenly turn up again because they had a holiday in another paddock, you can bring their data back in again. But over time, you'll probably want to tidy up that master file a little bit, because you'll end up with so much stuff that you're saving for years on animals that aren't in the flock anymore. So I like the status idea, because you can mark stuff as current but still keep the old stuff there. But then after ages and ages, you might just archive a whole chunk and go, let's just get rid of this, and I'll save it as an archived file somewhere in case I want it later, but I don't need it clogging up my spreadsheet. Otherwise, you're not with hundreds and hundreds of columns. So a couple of different strategies there, but definitely keep it all in one file, because from the analysis side of things, I like to have them all in one to be able to do things like pivot tables. No worries,
Thank you.
Lucy.
Looks like we've got a few more people typing their questions. So while we're waiting for a few more questions to come through, I'll just share my screen, which will pop up with a feedback form. So in the chat, Tani's already added a link, if you like, to the evaluation form for today, or you can take a photo of the screen there and use the QR code there. All the evaluations really incredibly helpful for us when we're designing our carbon farming outreach program activities. So your feedback helps shape what we do next. So while we're getting those questions in, you're welcome to start that feedback form if you like.
Will this be open? Will that stay open for a little while for anyone watching afterwards?
Yes, yep,
okay.
It will. It will. And if you're struggling with the typing, you can raise your hand, and I'm happy to take you off mute instead to ask a question.
And Bronwyn, also happy for you to circulate the PDF of the PowerPoint so people can flick through at their leisure.
Thank you. I'll make sure that gets sent out next week. All right. One more slide. Thank you. Go for it, Tani.
Hey, Elise, I just wanted to know if you had any tips about spotting some of the bad data or dirty data you were talking through earlier. It just seems like there's so many stages to this to make the most of the eID that it would be really easy to introduce errors.
Yeah, that's right. So software programs probably do have inbuilt filters and might pop up little messages, validation type things to pick up anomalies with data. But most of the stuff I do is just in Excel. So what I would tend to do as well, Tani, is when you open up that session file and you're just having a scroll through to see if it all looks sensible, I would just, you can run a filter across the top of your Excel file. So every column gets a nice little sort button, and be very careful when you're using filters in an Excel file, because if you don't have a filter across every single column, you'll scramble it as soon as you start sorting. But I like to run a filter across the whole top. And then each trait that you've recorded, I think Fiona just popped a message up. I didn't read the whole thing, but she was recording breech wrinkle and a few of those sort of visual traits. So you can just sort one at a time by each of the traits that you've collected on that day, sort lowest to highest, and then sort highest to lowest, and just have a quick look at what the minimum and maximum values are in that file. And you'll very quickly see if there's a weight that pops up and, you know, the average of the mob was 35 kilos, but an individual 7 kilos, you will automatically know that's wrong. I'll just delete it because it's not right. Or if you've got a breech wrinkle and usually you're scoring 1 to 5 for breech wrinkle, or pregnancy status is usually 1 to 3, and you suddenly get a 7, and you think, well, that's clearly a typo, but I can't be confident what the typo was. So it's often most accurate to delete that data point. So that's what I would do. Just do a quick filter on all those different traits you've recorded, and just I would delete or put an X, like a cross for an X. So you know it's not a 0 when you're putting it into your, when you do that VLOOKUP formula. If cells are blank, it actually puts a 0 value in as that trait, which sometimes is a legitimate value. If you're putting pregnancy scanning data in a 0, is actually a valid data point. So you want to make sure in your pregnancy scanning column, if it's actually blank, before you transfer it across, put a cross in there, like a little X, and that just tells me I'm missing that data point. So when you do the VLOOKUP formula, it's going to put an X as the pregnancy status for that animal for that year. It's not going to mistakenly record it as being dry. Fiona's got a few things she's been writing, I think, if someone could read them out.
Sure, yep. We are no longer mulesing, so we're now recording breech cover and breech wrinkle in the cradle against eID, along with I've just lost it. Along with year, gender, and birth type. Is this worthwhile as a commercial flock, or will I get just a quick change by selecting for size with high rankings on these traits? How much faster genetic gain can I make by doing one or both? Good questions.
Yeah, I would say that, Fiona, probably genetics is probably the fastest way to make the greatest change, but there's still going to be quite a bit of variation there because it's going to take years to phase out the genetics of your current ewe flock. So breech wrinkle and breech cover, I think they're very worthwhile to record on your lambs in the marking cradle because it's not very time consuming or costly thing to do. And there's going to be variation there. So if you can automatically use it as a bit of a filter, then any ewes over a certain threshold will not enter your breeding flock. Whether you need to class that at marking time or whether you can see it off shears at classing time, you might not need to record it at marking if you can just do it very easily. You know, if you're classing your hogget ewes at off shears, for example, and you can see those traits then and there, then maybe you don't need to do it at marking time. But if you're not shearing at the right time to be able to see that, or it's too hard to do it at classing time, then you could have done a pre-draft, and anything with a certain level at marking time just goes automatically out. So I would say overall you can make probably faster gains through your ram source. If you're going to switch to a ram source, it's vastly different to what you're already on. But once you sort of stabilize your ram source, then yes, I think it's worthwhile doing individual selection on your ewe replacements.
Yeah, it's got another interesting question here I want to know the answer to. Which ear tags have the highest retention rate? Collecting the data is great, but losing tags is very frustrating as the data on that individual is lost.
So theoretically, any NLIS approved tag, which is all the main ones we're talking about, not everyone's using them. Yes, shearers cut them off too. Yes. Every tag company to be NLIS approved has to go through the same rigorous checks and balances and retention rates as every other company. However, yes, we all have issues and stories, and 2021 yellow tags was, for some producers, irrespective of company, an absolute disaster. And I can only put it down to they must be sharing the same plastic manufacturer, and there must have been a dodgy batch of yellow plastic that went to Allflex and it went to Shearwell as well. And I don't know where else, because some producers are still complaining on Twitter. Yes, Fiona's saying our yellow tags were a disaster. Some people had no issues, they were normal. Other people are every year saying 20% of our yellow tags are gone again, 20% of our yellow tags are gone again. So there was obviously some catastrophic issue with the plastic, and it wasn't related to a tag company because Shearwell people and Allflex people had the same issue. So with that issue aside, because the yellow tags in certain batches were rooted, I don't know that there's any particular, people have preferences. Overwhelmingly, I think my clients use Shearwell. That's partly a cost thing as well. I know they're a bit cheaper than an Allflex tag, or they have been in the past. They're also a much slimmer tag. Part of the reason for Allflex's chunky tag is they've designed them with a really thick post. So theoretically, a shearer, it won't get cut with a shearer's handpiece, but that really thick post can cause a lot of issues, infection, bigger hole in the ear. Those tags tend to turn around a lot more and get ripped out and stuck. So a lot of people go, look, I actually really like the Shearwell ones. They're really snug. They're small. They're snug. Some stud breeders like the big printed number on the Allflex tag, but let's be honest, if we're using eID and wands and chips and scanners, we shouldn't have to read a number on a tag unless it's a dead animal or something stuck on its back in the paddock that we're pulling a lamb out of. We shouldn't have to read visual numbers. So the size of that printed number is less of an issue these days. So I would say, Fiona, overwhelmingly, my clients use Shearwell, just looking at the prefix on the eID tags in my Excel files. But yeah, sorry about your yellow tag. That's a widespread issue.
Thank you, Elise. Stephen has raised his hand. So Stephen, I have taken you off mute, so you should be able to ask your question. Or if you're having trouble with the text, Stephen, you can type.
Oh, hang on. I have to unmute myself. Sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep. Hi, Elise. Thanks.
Hello.
Really enjoyed it. I picked up a few pointers about. I might have to have a bit of a tidy up with some of the things, but I like the conversation about the tags because, as you're aware, I've had a bit of an issue with tags pulling out, and we've discussed it. So we looked at whether to go with the round button tags or the smaller ones, and I talked to some people who were using the button tags, and they were having the same problem, in that the button would get stuck behind the wire and it would pull out as well too. So because I've got neighbours with, we have some issues with fencing. If I found with the eID tag, if I stuck with the year of colour, we couldn't distinguish them easily because they'd be jumping. So I've stuck with yellow because I can see yellow really easily as the eID tag. And I know in Victoria, there's no rule against having to have your eID in the year of birth colour, and then gone with a non-eID in the year of birth with a number on it. And I quite like your idea of going to using the year plus then the number. So I might go to that. But losing tags, if you lose the tag, you've lost the data, and then you've sort of had a bit of a loss then, and you're not able to capitalise on it. But I'll have to have a look at the Shearwell's tags as well too, because I appreciate your comments about them being a smaller and more compact tag as well too.
To get Vic, yeah.
Yeah.
So Stephen's sort of alluded to the fact that he started double tagging his ewe replacement. So once, basically on the marking cradle, Stephen, isn't it? But you're just doing ewes because
yes, that's exactly right. I don't worry about the weathers because they're going to be sold.
That's right. Safeguarding that data that's being collected. So in the case that they lose an eID tag, we haven't lost everything. We've actually matched them up with a management number. So we've still got that data, and we can assign a new eID tag to that animal and still have its history. So I think that's a worthwhile thing to consider as well. And I didn't mention in my preso, so thanks for bringing it up, Stephen. But if you're investing in all this data, really heartbreaking when a tag gets lost. So it might be worthwhile spending that 30 cents or whatever it is on a secondary tag just to safeguard those animals that are your replacements, that you know that you're not going to have a proportion of them that essentially become an unknown, and you find it hard to justify keeping them because you just don't know who they are or what they've done.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really, really worthwhile thing to do, Elise, because I really haven't found a lot of difference between the style of tags. They still get lost. Sheep still put their head through the fence. And if they rip both tags out, well, maybe you should be in the freezer.
That's right. They're too naughty.
Yes. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're right on 5 o'clock. And it has been 2 fairly solid hours of information there. There's a lot to take on board, and I've got a long list of notes of hints and tips that I'll make sure that we're implementing on our farm. Many thanks, Elise, for your skills and experience. Thank you so much for sharing it with us, and everyone who's joined us, thank you so much for spending the afternoon with us. Just before I head off, I'll let you know of 2 upcoming events we've got in the Wimmera in Feb next year. One's with Dr. Cass Schaaf, who's a soil scientist, and will be addressing soil constraints and nutrition. And another one in Feb where we'll meet together at the CMA office, and we can help you run through your farm's carbon emissions. So we'll run through the calculator. There's 2 upcoming options. And if you're ever after any information when it comes to carbon and emissions for farms, you've got 2 really good sources at Landcare Victoria and Agriculture Victoria. We'll pop those details in the chat. Thanks again for your time, and hopefully we'll see you at some other CFOP events next year. Thanks, everyone.
And fill out the evaluation form, please, everyone. Yeah, thanks Bronwyn and Tani for organising and running the session. And I welcome any questions from participants on the call and the ones that catch up with it later on. I'm happy to answer any questions that come through afterwards. Thank you.